Seen from afar, the city of Ordos in China's Inner Mongolia isn't all that remarkable. A bit artificial looking, sure, with its blue Mongolian yurt-inspired homes protruding from the desert. Some might liken its Genghis Khan mausoleum, its public light show, and giant prancing horse statues to Disneyland. It seems designed more to be looked at than lived in. As you move closer, however, the moment buildings become more than mere shapes, you will undoubtedly feel a certain eeriness consume you. Something seems off. Your eyes feel lied to. Because no amount of elaborate museums, extravagant stadiums, malls, or even horse statues can make up for what Ordos is missing: people. Now, in fairness, it's not, strictly speaking, empty. Low-density planning may conceal them, but a few people do work, study, shop, and live here. About 150,000 according to the government. But nowhere near the 1 million it originally planned for in the early 2000s. Then, newly rich after 1/3 of the country's natural gas and 1/6 of its coal reserves were found here, local officials had grand ambitions to build a newer, modern showpiece district. Here, it built all the best schools, hospitals, and yes, Genghis Khan mausoleums. What it forgot were supermarkets, department stores, and bars. And so, for its first few years, just 30,000 people lived in a city designed for 30 times more. Ordos is far from the crowded, vibrant, modern China you've come to expect, which makes it a perfect Rorschach test. When news of this weird ghost city first emerged in 2011, provocative photos of empty and half-finished buildings fit all too neatly into the story of China the world was eager to hear. The picture was one of comic book level, growth at all costs, bridge to nowhere inefficiencies. It seemed to validate the most extreme skeptics, that the whole of China, 1.4 billion people and all, might one day be revealed as one giant elaborate cardboard facade. Others argued this was, most charitably, a misunderstanding. As so often happens with this opaque country, the language barrier, a lack of context, or just plain sensationalism conspired to tell the wrong story. China plans years ahead, they said, and this was just an example of especially early planning for millions of incoming migrants. In hindsight, both reactions contain some truth. Ordos does have an interesting story to tell, just not the one you might expect. The missing context at the time was far stranger than what the unimaginative pessimists concocted. Nearly all of these half-finished homes have owners, the vast majority of which have no intention of ever moving in. Ordos is not unique. All over China are millions of empty, some unfinished, but almost universally sold homes. Not just in far-flung corners, but also in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. Over 1/5 of all urban homes, 65 million in all, sit vacant. Housing is the second of China's chronically ill internal organs, the symptoms of which it feels quite acutely in the form of impossibly unaffordable real estate. Acknowledging the severity of the problem, however, admits of weakness, suggests poor governance, and stands in stark contrast to the mighty, robust superpower image China is desperate to project. It's time to look past China's bold, aggressive exterior, peek inside at the true state of its health, and make a diagnosis. Sponsored by Audible. Listen to China the Bubble That Never Pops, or one of thousands of other great audiobooks for free with a link in the description. Anyone who's taken Macroeconomics 101 is familiar with the letters C, I, G, and NX. C is consumption, the phones, toys, and macroeconomic textbooks we don't illegally download. Investment is anything bought but not consumed. Think factories, machines, and homes. G stands for government spending, And finally, net exports are what is sold overseas. Add these handy little numbers up and you have a country's GDP. The great thing about this formula is that it turns abstract terms like growth into concrete buckets. What it means is that there are really only 4 ways for a country to grow its economy. And while a dollar is a dollar, regardless of which bucket it comes from, not all buckets are created equal, something China knows well. Its early growth famously relied on exports. It became the world's factory and gained a reputation for cheap mass production. The problem is that exports are a double-edged sword. They rely on a surplus of cheap labor, which means, by definition, wages are low. You can only compete with the entire rest of the world for so long, and neither do you want to. Low-value manufacturing has long since moved south to places like Vietnam, Laos, and Bangladesh. Next came investment, which peaked at nearly half of China's GDP in 2011 and is reflected in its shiny new airports, train stations, and office buildings. But there are natural limits on investment too. In the beginning, basic infrastructure like roads, bridges, and ports see quick and substantial returns. These are the easy targets. Eventually, a nation simply runs out of them, forcing it to take on riskier and less profitable projects. Government spending, meanwhile, is constrained by tax revenues and debt. That leaves only C, consumption. Consumption-led growth is the final stage on the road to economic development. It means workers are educated, productive, and have enough confidence to let go of their hard-earned cash. If China is ever to become the rich nation it dreams of, it will first need to stop saving and get shopping. This may come as a surprise. We've all been bombarded with reminders of China's rising middle class and immense purchasing power. But consumption is the product of population size times individual spending. When multiplied together, China, the country, may be a force to be reckoned with, but it's important to remember the former, its massive population size, is doing most of the work. Individually, Chinese consumers really don't spend very much, just 32% of GDP, less than half that of the US, and far below countries like Japan and Germany. Worse, this number has actually been decreasing over time. There are a few reasons why. First, China has a weak social security system, forcing workers to save for themselves and spend with greater caution. Second, income tax in all its various forms can be as high as 40%. But there's another reason. Chinese consumers are spending, but only on one thing, something not considered consumption: houses. Now, there is of course no one Chinese consumer or Chinese mind any more than there is a singular American or European one. But that need not stop us from observing what cannot adequately be described as a mere tendency or trend. China is absolutely obsessed with real estate. For starters, its home ownership rate is among the highest in the world, 90%, to much of the developed world's mid-60s. It gets much weirder still. If you can believe it, the majority of recent purchases have been second and third homes. In 2018, for instance, 87% of new home buyers already owned at least one. Needless to say, these numbers are peculiar. If everyone owns 2 or 3 homes, who is left to live in all of them? The answer is absolutely no one. Vacancy rates vary considerably by city size, but remain high in absolute terms across the board. Once again, China ranks near the top in what may look like a lazy repurposing of earlier graphs. Clearly, all of these homes are intended as investments. But that only answers one question by raising another. Again, why? China's passion for real estate began in the late 90s, when it teased privatization by offering state employees the right to buy their homes at a steep discount, in what was intended as a form of welfare. Then, in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, China opened the floodgates to everyone, supported by generously low interest rates. Having taken off at the right time in the country's development, housing prices would fall only once in the 2 decades that followed. But while housing gained a reputation as a safe and profitable investment, China's stock market became synonymous with volatility and risk. Because the government tightly controls how much cash is allowed to leave the country, Chinese people simply don't have a lot of options, and of them, housing is seen as the only sure thing. In addition to these financial considerations, there are simple, practical ones. The reality in 21st century China is that for men, homeownership equals marriage. Decades of the one-child policy have resulted in millions more men than women, unintentionally tipping the scale in favor of the latter. Young women and their families have become awfully picky, and that means luxury cars, watches, and yes, homes are now mere prerequisites. This study, for example, found that home prices are higher in cities with more unbalanced male-to-female ratios. An estimated 30% of all new home sales are attributed to this purpose. For all these reasons, prices have risen to extreme levels. In Shenzhen, Beijing, and Shanghai, it takes 40 years of the average income to afford a home. Today, the vast majority are bought before construction has even started, sometimes years in advance. It's common for developers to sell batches of property in glitzy online events, sometimes hosted by a celebrity. Thousands of apartments often sell out within minutes. In other cities, the right to buy homes is raffled off in lotteries, giving the winners mere hours to submit their down payments or else lose their opportunity. What all of these insane numbers and facts have in common is that they're classic signs of a speculative market. The underlying assumption is that prices will only ever go up. There's just one problem. Simple demographics suggest otherwise. In the next 10 years, China's over 55 age cohort will increase in size by 120 million, the entire population of Japan. By the end of this century, its overall population will be cut in half. The majority of homebuyers, meanwhile, are aged between 20 and 50, precisely the segment China will soon lose. Not only will there be fewer people around, but this mass of seniors will also have very different housing needs. 10 years ago, it was easy to argue that China's rapid urbanization would bring more than enough migrants to cities, effectively canceling out the effects of aging. Today, less so. With an urbanization rate of 60%, the growth rate of new migrants is clearly slowing, and those still arriving are getting older. Some are unable to find jobs, causing them to return to the countryside. The uncomfortable reality is we've already seen peak migration, and it's all downhill from here. Eventually, it would seem, supply has to catch up with demand. It doesn't take a wild imagination to draw parallels between China today and the US pre-2008. It's time to address the elephant in the room. What would a popping of this bubble look like? The simplest answer is that housing directly contributes 15% of GDP, but this significantly undersells its importance. Economists estimate that when everything related to real estate is accounted for, construction, appliances, furniture, agents, and so on, that number is really closer to 30%. Its largest banks are unsurprisingly heavily dependent on mortgages. It's estimated that a 20% fall in real estate activity could lead to a 5 to 10% drop in GDP. The IMF, meanwhile, estimates a 1% drop in China's demand would decrease global GDP by 0.25%. Banks, families, businesses, and the nation as a whole have a staggering number of eggs in one questionable basket. Now, let's be clear. A sudden and rapid fall in prices is the worst-case scenario. More than a few experts argue this is far from inevitable, and there are credible reasons to think China is not about to experience another 2008. One difference that cannot go unnoticed are the high down payments required in China, sometimes as high as 1/3 of the price. For second homes, 70% is not uncommon. These buyers are not being sold bad loans. The government has in place truly strict purchasing requirements. People are simply going to extreme lengths to afford them, pooling together money with family, foregoing all other luxuries, and borrowing from friends. Likewise, pessimism is far from new. Experts and non-experts alike have anticipated a financial catastrophe for years, and they've been proven wrong every single time. It would be a shame, however, to let extreme hypothetical disaster overshadow the very real consequences felt today. Forget collapse, something truly, deeply unhealthy is going on already. Housing this unaffordable is a problem all on its own, and an illness need not be fatal to cause significant harm. Remember how we got here. Chinese consumers only have so much money, and by spending it all on empty third homes, they don't spend it on more productive alternatives. Because banks rely on property as collateral, companies are forced to shift their spending away from innovation, manufacturing, and trade. If prices fall, yes, there would be serious consequences. But if they don't fall, regular people everywhere will, quite literally, pay the price. Beyond the obvious stress this generates, high prices constrain mobility, particularly for the same rural migrants China desperately needs to keep the momentum going. Not to mention the millions of men left behind with no hope of marriage. The best counterargument goes something like this. Housing policy is well understood, solutions to problems like these are known, and if any government in the world has the unilateral authority to implement reforms, China is it. When its stock markets experience too much volatility, China simply bans those words from social media. The issue with this argument is that it conflates can with will. However paramount China's central government may appear from the outside, the reality is much more complicated. Local and provincial governments, while subservient, are not puppets. Politicians everywhere have their own set of goals and interests, which may or may not align with those of the nation, just as American states don't always see eye to eye with DC. One reason for this divergence is that local governments are placed in an awkward position. In 1994, they were handed the responsibility of paying for their own social services. Most taxes, meanwhile, are sent straight to Beijing. Suddenly overwhelmed with bills and no way to pay them, local authorities got clever. The one power they do have is control of land, all of which is owned by the state in China. And so they created what are basically state-owned shell companies called local government financing vehicles. They gave these LGFVs free valuable land, which they then used to take out loans that the local governments themselves couldn't. The trick is that because their debt is hidden, local governments appear far healthier than they really are, while at the same time meeting the quotas set by Beijing. Following the 2008 crisis, LGFVs transformed from a little quirk of its financial system to the backbone of local economies. If these financing vehicles default on their loans, or if housing prices fall too steeply, local governments now have just as much to lose as homeowners. If a local government stops taking out loans, it instantly loses over 1/3 of its revenue, causing a different kind of doomsday. So while the central government may direct local officials to control their debt, the best they can really do is feign cooperation. Again, these are not insurmountable challenges, but the solutions are far too costly to assume their implementation. Anyone who portrays the Chinese government as an all-powerful monolith, always willing to make such drastic structural reforms, must contend with its complete inaction when faced with a declining birth rate during the final years of the one-child policy. To solve the problem would require a delicate and invasive surgery, one which risks making the problem worse. To accept these short-term losses to its economic growth, its social stability, and global narrative, the country's leaders would need to exhibit wild confidence. To survive such an operation, in other words, its health would otherwise need to be quite strong. In truth, China's government knows it faces several ailing organs in the years to come, including one at the very heart of its continued physical survival. Next time, in part 3 of China's Reckoning. In the meantime, you might be wondering how the housing market has fared during coronavirus. When it first began spreading, alarms were raised that perhaps this would finally initiate the housing collapse long anticipated. After a rocky first few months of the year, not only were skeptics proven wrong, but the pandemic drove prices even higher. By June, they were up 4.9%, and one of its largest developers had increased its annual sales target by 23%. How does it, time and time again, avoid disaster? Before we reconvene for part 3, I'm going to assign you some homework to answer this question. China, the Bubble That Never Pops, is one of the books I myself listened to on Audible while researching this video, and consider it essential listening to understand the whole picture of what we've just scratched the surface of in this video. The reason I love Audible is that when you download a book, you own it. You can listen back at any time, download it to your device, and bring it with you wherever you go. With an Audible membership, you get 1 credit a month to listen to any of its thousands of great audiobooks. You also get free access to its Plus catalog of books, podcasts, guided meditations, and much more. Visit audible.com/polymatter or text polymatter to 500-500 to get 1 free audiobook of your choice and start listening today.